you all so much for coming out. This is Bluestockings Bookstore, Cafe and Activist Center. We've been here since 1999. We're a volunteer-run space, collectively owned.
Thank you all for coming. It's really great to see you all here. I'm going to read a little from my book, pictured behind me, talk a little bit about what's in it, and then we can open up and have a conversation, a Q&A, and the whole thing. All right? So first, I'm going to read an excerpt from the second chapter of the book. The image of British Member of Parliament Mavis Tate flickers onto the screen. I, as a Member of Parliament, visited Buchenwald concentration camp with 9 others, she opens. Some people believe that the reports of what happened there are exaggerated. Cut to stacks of emaciated bodies in the back of a truck. No words could exaggerate, Tate clarifies. We saw and we know. A man attempts to shovel out charred skeletons from industrial ovens. The reality was indescribably worse than the pictures. Tate concluded with the ominous admonition, let no one say these things were never real. When the projection stopped in this small theater in northwest London in 1945, Morris Beckman and his cousin Harry Rose filed out into the lobby. Newsreels like this showed the world a sliver of Nazi terror, but it wasn't really until the 1970s that the Holocaust began to be perceived by both scholars and the general public as an historical event of major importance. But for Jews like Beckman and Rose, however, the horror could not be more palpable. They knew what post-war newsreels did not say, that most of the twisted corpses on the screen had belonged to adoring Jewish daughters, lovingly eccentric Jewish fathers, tough as nails Jewish grandmothers who gave a wry smile every time they recounted surviving the pogroms of their youth. Beckman and Rose didn't need to hear that from Mavis Tate. They were all too aware. They felt sick to their stomachs seeing bodies like skeletons covered with skin. Both Rose and Beckman had served in the war. Beckman was a radio operator in the Merchant Marine, and Rose was in a unit that had fought behind Japanese lines in Burma. As Jewish veterans, Nazism could not have been more personal. And so, as they walked home from the theater, they could not have been more appalled by what they saw. A former 18B detainee, which in Britain was someone who was imprisoned during the war for having Nazi sympathies, was on a platform shouting, "Not enough Jews were burned at Belsen. Not enough Jews were burned at Belsen." "I can't believe it," Rose exclaimed. Still in his uniform and medals, he complained to a nearby police officer who just shrugged his shoulders and walked away. "Well, I'll get the bastard," Rose said, but Beckman held him back, fearing arrest. "But isn't anybody going to do anything about this?" he asked. Over the next few years, the members and sympathizers of the approximately 14 fascistic groups in London and equivalent groups elsewhere orchestrated poster campaigns around the city with slogans like "Jews must go" and "War on the Jews." They attacked people in Jewish neighborhoods, they attempted to burn down synagogues, and they even threw petrol bombs into a trade union meeting. Not long after holding back his cousin from attacking a fascist speaker, Morris Beckman and 3 fellow Jewish veterans came upon another fascist meeting, this time run by the British League of Ex-Servicemen and Women. That day, Geoffrey Ham, formerly of the British Union of Fascists of Oswald Mosley, was denouncing the, quote, aliens in our midst who profited while our boys fought overseas. The Jewish veterans had enough. This group of 4, which included a judo expert, formerly of the Welsh Guards, a former Royal Air Force pilot, Beckman and another veteran spread out into the crowd of 60. As the judo expert pretended to buy copies of the League newspaper, he suddenly smashed the heads of the 2 fascist stewards together, and Beckman and the others toppled the stage, dispersing everyone. Beckman later explained that the sheer malevolence of the speaker had moved him and his comrades to physically shut down a post-war fascist meeting for the first time. It would not be the last. This direct action sparked the formation in March 1946 of the 43 Group, a militant anti-fascist organization composed mainly, but not entirely, of Jewish British veterans dedicated to shutting down fascism through direct action and pursuing legislation against racist incitement. The 43 group commando units had several methods of disrupting outdoor fascist meetings. If a single member could get through the line of fascist stewards to tip over the speaker's platform, the police had a rule of not allowing the fascists to set it up again. With that in mind, the group organized units of about a dozen into wedge formations. They would start out at an agreed time far away from the speaker, build up enough steam so that their units could break through many times more their number of fascists and get to the platform. If the platform was too well guarded, however, the commandos would disperse into the audience, start fights, start arguments, to the point where the disorder forced the police to shut down the event. Another method was to jump the pitch by occupying fascist meeting spaces before they could set up. By the summer of 1946, the 43 group was attacking 6 to 10 fascist meetings per week. And as an aside, let's step back and realize that in 1946, there were 6 to 10 fascist meetings a week in London. Beckman estimates that about a third were disrupted by the 43 group, about a third were ended by the police, and about a third continued. After a while, the 43 group became so popular that some locals would even shut down fascist meetings using the same tactics on their own. With the emergence of the, quote, fucking hard-cased East End Yids, as the black shirts called them, the, quote, keep your head down and get indoors quickly mentality had gone for good. So there's a lot of things that we can take out of this example, the example of the 43 group in post-war London. The 43 group formed in 1906 only lasted a few years because after a while the fascist threat had been at least relatively pushed into the darkness. But we can see a few things. One, fascism is dangerous even when it's small. If you read historians talking about the 1940s in London, they'll say, yeah, there were some far-right groups, but overall, in this perspective of British politics, they were trivial. They weren't important. But if you read testimonies of people who were afraid to walk out their front doors because they were fascists who were potentially going to attack them, who were targeting their places of worship, you can see that even in small doses, fascism is incredibly important. And we can see that for the 43 group, it was important to respond to it. What else can we learn? Well, I think that we can also learn that resistance is contagious. That after a while, the 43 group didn't even have to always lead the charge. That locals were empowered by the example of their direct action. We can also see that you can't always trust the majority to look out for the interests of minorities. The most of British society was not really concerned with what these fascists were doing to Jewish people. They had won the war, they were moving on. Right? So we can talk about it more later, but I think anti-fascism is a really interesting lens to think through the complexities of popular politics and think through what it means to resist when most people in society aren't necessarily sympathetic to what your plight is. And we can see that, at least in this case, anti-fascism can work. Throughout the media coverage of the whole Antifa question, the question always is analyzed in the abstract. How many pundits from Politico or CNN ever really take the time to read into these examples? If they did, they'd see there actually are a ton of examples of consistent direct action campaigns stopping the advance of white supremacists and fascists. And I think that from a common sense perspective, if you think of how hard it is to organize movements, how hard it is to organize politics in general, if there are people who are trying to physically disrupt you at every turn, that's going to make it even harder, and it certainly did in this case. A little bit about the book before I get into it more. So, as a way of background, I'm a historian, I'm an activist. I did not write this from firsthand experience doing anti-fascist work. The purpose of this book is to convey the lessons that I've learned from my historical research and from interviewing 61 current and former anti-fascists from 17 different countries in North America and Europe. So the goal of the book is to bring these insights forward, to educate a broader population about the century-old history of anti-fascism, and to try and cross-pollinate some insights from different movements from different parts of the world. So just as a way of setting up what my agenda is here. Let's talk a little bit about what led up to the 43 group. We don't have time to get into all of the history, so I'm going to run through it real quick.
There he is.
I don't know. Oh, all right, okay, all right. We're good. Okay. Mussolini and the black shirts. So, apologies, this is going to be quick. I get into it in a little more detail in the book, but even the book runs through some of this quickly. We can see that one of the most important early militant anti-fascist formations was the Arditi del Popolo in Italy, formed in 1921 as an armed militia to fight back against Mussolini's black shirts. It was formed and composed of militants across the anti-fascist spectrum. Anarchists, socialists, communists, Republicans, anyone who was ready to pick up a rifle and defend their town or village against black shirts who were systematically beating them up, murdering them, burning down their social centers and union offices. The Arditi del Popolo unfortunately did not stop the advance of fascism. Had they, maybe we wouldn't be here today, but that's another conversation. So what happened is essentially, by the time they started, it was a little too late. And that's one of the lessons, I think, of interwar fascism is all too often the threat of fascism wasn't taken seriously enough until it was too late. That started to change in the 30s, but we'll get to that. And so ultimately, the Socialist Party pulled out of the Arditi del Popolo to sign a pact of pacification with Mussolini, and eventually the Communist Party pulled out. A lot of the rank-and-file members did not, and they stayed to fight, but it was actually only anarchist organizations that formally stayed. And also as a way of explanation, I focus on fascism and anti-fascism when fascist regimes are not already in power, so I don't focus a lot in the book on partisan resistance, so you'll excuse me, I just couldn't get to everything. There are plenty of books about that too, and it's also important. Let's just skip over to Germany a little bit here. I'll try to get out of the way if people can't see some of these images, but these are some images from the Red Front Fighters League, which was formed by the Communist Party in the 1920s as a paramilitary formation in the tradition of other communist paramilitary formations that had formed during the several German uprisings of the late teens and early 20s. You'll notice the fist. This is where the anti-fascist slash communist slash left fist comes from. They developed it as a symbol of authority. Now, of course, fists had been used in the labor movement and elsewhere previously, but the lineage that we get through to the anti-fascist fist runs through this group. And they got the fist in the bottom. They were not really formed as an anti-fascist force, per se. They were formed more as a revolutionary force because in the 20s, the communists didn't really take the Nazis seriously. And so they were more interested in revolutionary action, broadly construed, not necessarily primarily fighting fascists. Here we have the Iron Front formed by the German socialists. It was formed primarily on the instigation of the Reichsbanner, which was a socialist Republican militia in the 20s, but it developed a symbol that's lived on in anti-fascist lore, the three arrows. So we can see it used to cross out the swastika on the top left. We can see it on flags. We can see in the bottom left these socialist youth holding three arrows. The origin of it is pretty interesting. There was a Russian emigre walking around the streets of, I think it was Berlin, and he sees a swastika with an arrow crossing it out, or a line crossing it out. And he imagines it as three arrows crossing out the Nazi swastika and adopts it as a symbol. The Iron Front was not really primarily a paramilitary organization. It was primarily an electoral formation that the Socialist Party wanted to use to essentially rebrand itself. And so part of it was an attempt to deflect from the fact that the Socialist Party had accepted austerity measures from the government, and so you get the Iron Front composed of the Reichsbanner militia and other kind of socialist formations. When push came to shove, it really didn't have much of a paramilitary role. So, Iron Front, and we can see that subsequently, the three arrows of anti-fascism has become a lasting symbol of the struggle. In the post-war era, it was mostly used by socialist parties in sort of a generic socialist symbol, but has subsequently been adopted by anti-fascism moving forward. Then that takes us to the creation of Anti-Fascist Action by the German Communist Party and related communist organizations in 1932. Here we have a Communist Party office, and you can see the two flags of Anti-Fascist Action on the window there. This was created, once again, largely in response to the Iron Front as an electoral vehicle to compete with the growing prestige of the Iron Front. There were paramilitary formations part of it, but its main focus was electoral struggle, not primarily direct confrontation, although that was part of it. The two flags were, of course, originally red. in an effort, part of the effort of this was to recruit rank and file Social Democrats over to the Communist Party. Yet it was very much a communist organization, and so they were really only interested in working with Social Democrats when Social Democrats would come over to their party, because you still have the third period analysis when the Communist Party considers socialists, or at least their leaders, to be social fascists. All right, trying to move along here. I'm not really going to get into the Spanish Civil War, I'm sorry to disappoint, but you can't go on without it. One thing I will say is, in terms of taking fascism seriously, we can see that the Italian socialist and communist parties did not really take Mussolini seriously enough until he was a dictator. We can see that the German leftists, for the most part, did not really take Hitler seriously enough. You can see that when you look at the slogan of the German Communist Party, when Hitler took power, was "First Hitler, then us." So the idea was that Hitler would get into power, he would do a terrible job, he would last 9 months, and then the communists could ride his coattails and be much better by comparison. And that did not happen, of course. So I think it really wasn't until 1934 in Vienna, when you get the uprising of the socialists against the right-wing government, that you first see the European left taking fascism seriously as an existential threat to its existence. After Hitler comes into power and consolidates power. So the Spanish Civil War is really the first large manifestation of the European and the global left saying, if we don't stop fascism here, it will destroy all of us. And so in the sort of the legacy of interwar anti-fascism, I think that's sort of an important takeaway for that. Quickly, Battle of Cable Street, 1936. So you get the British Union of Fascists intending to march through the East End of London, a predominantly Jewish but largely immigrant neighborhood. And there's a lot of interesting politics that go into debates on the left about how to respond to this. At least at first, the Communist Party encourages its members not to protest against this, but to go to a demonstration in favor of the Spanish Republic. They get a lot of flack for it. They change course, encourage people to show up at the demonstration. And essentially, 100,000 anti-fascists show up to block the route of Mosley's British Union of Fascists. Mosley and his fascists, I think they bring out about 6,000 people. They can't move, there's no space to move, and the police cancel the march. Most of the actual battle was not against the fascists, it was against the police, who were trying to push back the anti-fascists. And so that, if we're thinking about the role of the police and the role of confrontation in the anti-fascist struggle, you often can't have the conversation without also talking about the police, as you can see in this case. Much more to be said about this, but we're moving on. Okay, jump way ahead. All right, so anti-fascism never really goes away. That's especially evident in Britain. So as we saw before, the war ends, militant anti-fascism doesn't end, in large part because in Britain, fascists were still allowed to organize and they had broader free speech and political rights in the 40s and 50s. So in a certain sense, militant anti-fascism in Britain from the Battle of Cable Street up through today never really stops. The legacy continues, the generations are consistent with each other. That was different in continental Europe, where the governments that were formed after World War II were formed as explicitly anti-fascist institutions. They were formed to squelch fascism or Nazism. In Germany, West Germany, well, also East Germany, and Italy and elsewhere, you couldn't just say, all right, yeah, Hitler was right, let's start over again. It wasn't allowed. And so in that way, it made the role of anti-fascism in an immediate sense in continental politics in Europe was relatively minimal up and through until maybe the 70s or 80s. In Britain, it was continuous. So I'm just jumping forward ahead here to the 70s, when once again the anti-fascist movement never really went away, but it becomes strong again. We can look at the formation of the Anti-Nazi League, followed not long after the Battle of Lewisham, which was sort of similar to the Battle of Cable Street in some ways. And we can see once again in terms of symbols that the arrow is adopted from the 3 arrows of the Iron Front from the 30s. So the arrow, the single arrow, as in the Smash Nazis image, is brought up again. The Anti-Nazi League was essentially created by the Socialist Workers' Party, and different factions within it focused on electoral angles and direct action angles. It, of course, had a very important cultural component with Rock Against Racism, pushing back against the creation of a neo-Nazi skinhead movement largely through the National Front. And really we can see also in the post-war period a shift in European fascist politics from focusing on anti-Semitism to focusing on targeting new waves of migration. So in the case of Britain, this was often South Asian and Caribbean migration. In the case of Turkey later on, of Greece, Germany, it was Turks and other immigrants. And so Rock Against Racism helps to push back and push the neo-Nazi skinheads out of the punk scene. This is, of course, a common conversation when we think of the revival of militant anti-fascism in the 70s, 80s, and 90s, is contestations over subcultural spaces like punk scenes and so forth. And it's really astounding just how much the neo-Nazi skinhead movement created in Europe spread. Now, for those of you who don't know, skinhead culture was not racist in the beginning. That's important to know, and it still continues an anti-racist tradition to this day. But there was a neo-Nazi skinhead variant created, and so those contestations became important. Moving along to Anti-Fascist Action, formed in the mid-'80s, out of, essentially, without getting into too much of the organizational details, out of groups that came out of the Anti-Nazi League. And as a quick aside, there was a lot of IRA and Irish Republican solidarity work done by Anti-Fascist Action, in part because the British fascists were very much in league with the Ulster loyalists, and so that was part of the conversation as well. And Anti-Fascist Action, of course, was a militant anti-fascist network with groups around the country. When we think about militant anti-fascism in the post-war period, the 70s, 80s, and 90s, there are really sort of, I'd argue, two threads to focus on. One is the British thread, the other is the German. So let's talk a little bit about the German, and we can get some comparisons here. So this is a demonstration of the German Autonomen in memory of an anti-fascist named Connie who died when she was running away from police and they chased her into an oncoming car. The German autonomous movement is really important to understand when we talk about anti-fascism in terms of its tactics, strategies, and aesthetics. It developed in the 80s, not really primarily initially around fighting fascists, more in terms of the anti-nuclear movement, defending the squatting scene, fighting back against police brutality. But they did start, as the 80s progressed, more and more organizing against Hitler birthdays, commemorations of Rudolf Hess, and other kind of Nazi figures. By the late 80s, this starts to shift. When the Berlin Wall goes down, this really intense neo-Nazi backlash emerges. It gets so bad that a lot of international governments issue travel warnings to Germany. Amnesty International writes a report condemning neo-Nazi violence. The police are complicit. The politicians don't care. Migrant refuges, migrant centers are firebombed. It's insane, and the main direct action response took an anti-fascist form, not only organized by German leftists, but also by migrants themselves. So there were Turkish anti-fascist groups, specifically Turkish groups that were formed as well. Some of the early anti-fascist periodicals in Germany were published in German and Turkish. And so we can see that the black bloc tactic, I imagine most people here are aware that the black bloc is not a specific group, it is a tactic. The black bloc tactic grows out of the German autonomous movement, although it does have precedents and similarities in the Japanese Zengakuren and other kinds of examples of street confrontation. And so when we think of sort of what anti-fascists look like on the streets, we can see some have taken a page out of the German autonomous movement, but others didn't. So I read some interesting accounts of conversations between British anti-fascists and German anti-fascists in the 90s. And many of the Brits preferred to dress in football casuals. So look like, as one anti-fascist phrased it, look like the police couldn't tell if they were fascists, anti-fascists, or hooligans, quote unquote. And in that way kind of blend into a large crowd. And so when some of these anti-fascists came to a march in Germany, they didn't want to march with the black bloc. They wanted to march separately because it wasn't how they did things. There are other interesting differences which we can get into. So when we think of the sort of strategy, methods, and tactics, the German trajectory and the British trajectory are two important ones. And more recently, over the past 5 or 10 years, you see more cross-pollination with some of the British groups adopting black bloc tactics. One was even called Antifa and so forth. And then also, similarly in the United States, anti-fascism over the last decade has been more influenced by the German model, whereas initially, so we're gonna have a quick deviation for the interest of flags. So in 1932, 2 red flags of Anti-Fascist Action. The earliest example I could find, and if someone knows an earlier example, please do share, of a black flag being put in was on the second issue of, I don't read German and I don't know how to pronounce that well, so I'm not gonna, of that periodical in December of '87. You see that one is black and one is red. Of course, bringing in the autonomous or anarchist influence. This was from 1992, so within a couple of years, the orientation is reversed. Instead of from going left to right, it's right to left, and today, more often than not, it's right to left. So I think those images and symbols are interesting, so there you have it. Anti-Racist Action, formed in the late 80s, largely based on the influence of the British model, because some of the early organizers were reading British periodicals, learning about how the British did it. And so there's more similarities in that way, whereas today I think there's a greater influence from the more continental traditions. Anti-Racist Action probably requires the least explanation of all of it, but just in short, became a decentralized network of militant anti-fascist groups across North America and to some extent Latin America that really probably peaked numerically in the 90s, continued on into the 2000s, and is the sort of predecessor of the Torch Network and other kinds of anti-fascist formations today. I'm sure there are people in this crowd who could do a better presentation on that than I could, which is awesome. All right, so how are we doing on time?
27 minutes.
I've been going for 27 minutes. All right. Yeah, that's fine, whatever. All right, so I'm going to comment on a few more things and then open it up because I'd be most interested to talk about what you all think is interesting. So one of the parts of this that I think I hope is a useful contribution is thinking about what lessons from the history of the 20s, 30s, and 40s have been useful for anti-fascists over the last few decades, and talk about how anti-fascism as a transnational movement only really makes sense historically if you think of it historically. So I have a chapter 4 in the book, 5 lessons from history for, I forgot how I phrased it, but it's a 5 lessons chapter, right? So what are some of those lessons? Well, one of them is that fascist regimes came to power legally, that fascist revolutions haven't succeeded, and that Hitler and Mussolini were not repelled by the power of parliamentary government. They rose to power through parliamentary government. And so when we think about anti-fascism, from a militant anti-fascist perspective, the main sort of other solution, quote unquote, to the fascist menace is what I've sort of somewhat accurately, somewhat dismissively called liberal anti-fascism. And that really amounts to 3 things. One is faith in reasoned debate to stop fascist ideas, faith in parliamentary government to stop their advance, and faith in the police to stop them if they do anything illegal. And we can clearly see that sometimes that works, right? Sometimes. I mean, there have been times when fascists just haven't been able to gain the sympathy of the police, haven't been able to really move ahead, but it sometimes doesn't. And so from a militant anti-fascist perspective, you don't count on those institutions. And we can see in the interwar period how they failed. Another thing is that the interwar anti-fascists were usually divided. Moments of actual anti-fascist unity before World War II were few and far between. We can even see with the Spanish Civil War, there was a moment when, at least on the surface, it seemed like all the left factions could get on the same page, ended up in street fighting and confrontation. I'm not going to get too far into my partisan sympathies on that or other matters. I'll put that aside. We can even see that with the Arditi del Popolo in Italy, after a while, socialist and communist leadership pulled out. Part of that is related to the fact that it wasn't really taken seriously enough until it was too late. So post-war anti-fascists argue that you need to take fascist and white supremacist organizing seriously from the first minute because it can grow. Pretty self-evident in my opinion, but some people don't see it that way. And related to that is that interwar anti-fascists, especially initially, did not really understand that fascism represented something new. It wasn't the same as traditional reactionary politics. a lot of early anti-fascists, when they were trying to analyze fascism, spoke about it in terms of the right-wing movements that came before it. They talked about fascists as being similar to the black and tans in the British Isles. They talk about them being similar to the white guards in Russia. And that's why the German Communist Party figured, if Hitler gets into power, they'll have their little kind of quasi-repressive fun, and then we'll get in. But fascism represented something new. It was not your simple kind of traditional right politics. And so, in my mind, that means that today we also need to be vigilant to the fact that right-wing politics will not always stay the same, that it will change, and that being sensitive to those differences and changes should inform how we organize against them. Because we've seen the damage that can come if you just assume that it's always going to be the same. And we've seen that small groups of fascists and white supremacists do not always stay small. We can see that Mussolini's initial fascist nucleus was 100 people. We can see that when Hitler attended his first meeting of the German Workers' Party before he turned it into the Nazi Party, it had 54 members. Now, at the time, there was no reason specifically for the left to have thought much of these groups, right? There were all sorts of little weird political factions out there, but they weren't so marginal after a while. And so I get into it in greater detail in the book, but I think that we can really understand that militant anti-fascism is really a very historically informed political tendency that has learned serious lessons from the successes and failures of those who fought before them. And it's incumbent upon us to think about it historically. What else did I want to talk about? So this is the first one of these that I've done, so if you come back to see me in a month, this is going to be real smooth. All right, so let me list some things that maybe people have questions about, but if no one has questions about, then we're definitely not going to talk about. So if you have a question about how anti-fascists understand free speech, I'll talk about it. If not, nothing will be said of that. If you have questions about perspectives on tactics, methods, and strategies, we'll talk about that. But before we go, I want to just touch on 2 points. First is, as I mentioned earlier, the point about popular politics. So I've learned a lot myself talking to anti-fascists about how to think about anti-fascism and popular politics. First, there's a range of perspectives. There are some anti-fascists I spoke to who essentially equate the two, essentially argue that the way you fight back against fascism is you build a popular left movement. There are others who have a focus more on how frequently to really do the work of anti-fascism, it requires you being unpopular. It requires you outing people who are part of left communities, who are actually Holocaust deniers, who are actually Islamophobes, but have a lot of friends. And so you can't simply just count on being popular or making friends to do anti-fascism. Other people talk about the fact that there are anti-fascist formations that are popular. There are other ones that are based more on small group actions, but sometimes they have the same membership and they do different things at different times. So in short, I think that there's a range of perspectives on how we can think about the popular and more small group militant actions that don't necessarily put them in contrast, but maybe do at times. And to me, that's especially interesting when we think of the role of minorities in popular politics. And I don't say minorities as like a weird liberal way of talking about people of color or queer and trans people or so forth and so on, but literally in terms of numbers, when you have a situation where you're trying to think through doing politics in a society where most people are predisposed to not get your back, how do you do that? And so for me, the Battle of Cable Street was really instructive in that way, because you got a situation where anti-Semitism maybe wasn't as bad in Britain as it was in some other countries, but it was pretty bad. You got a situation where there's a fascist group targeting a Jewish community. The Jewish community and their immigrant and left allies stand up to confront them. And what do you think the British press said? They were not too happy about that, right? So the public backlash against the Battle of Cable Street was thoroughly negative. The British Union of Fascists gained more recruits because of it, because all of the kind of anti-Semitic white conservatives in Britain said, oh, I'm going to join them and beat up some Jews. And you have acts of retaliation in the Jewish community. You have the Mile End pogrom over the next year and a lot of attacks. So how do we assess that history? One way of looking at it might be, well, okay, the Battle of Cable Street was a miscalculation because they should have better gauged British public opinion and done exactly what British society thought. That's one way of looking at it, and I've come across people who argue that. Another way of looking at it is that, maybe in certain cases, the popular opinion cannot be the gauge of resistance because it can end up in genocide, because the popular majority group isn't necessarily always going to have your back. So I think that we need to think a lot more about popular politics. I'm not trying to be against social movements because I'm a social movements guy. But there are times when you can't just do politics based on a poll or just do politics based on what your average person reading the newspaper thinks, especially when it comes to fighting back against the far right, especially when it comes to defending communities that are vulnerable against attack. Finally, I want to just point out one other thing. When we talk about anti-fascism or definitions of politics in general, definitions can be useful and clarifying, and they can be limiting. When we think of anti-fascism, I think it's essential to think of it. Let me take a step back. When I was trying to think about anti-fascism, right, I was trying to think, how do we get a handle on this? And I found it really helpful to turn to how Ami Césaire, the Martinican, right? Martinican writer, I'm forgetting which I was from, wrote about fascism. And he said that to some extent we can think of fascism as European imperialism and colonialism come home to roost in Europe. When we look at the ways that Hitler modeled the depopulation of Eastern Europe on the genocide of the indigenous population of the Americas, how the eugenics programs of the Nazis were modeled on American eugenics programs. There's a lot of more continuity, there's a lot more overlap in this. And so if we think of fascism as a specific variant on European imperialism and colonialism and white supremacy, then what it opens up in my perspective is thinking about fascism as anti-fascism as one facet of the broader struggle against white supremacy and domination in general. And so what I try to do with the book is focus on the roots of militant anti-fascism without allowing that to subsume all resistance, because as many of us know, there have been times and places when people who do not necessarily identify with anti-fascism have resisted and fought back against white supremacy in similar ways. And so my intention is by no means to eliminate those moments, but rather to not superimpose the lens of anti-fascism on all of resistance throughout all of time, because of course the struggle against white supremacy goes back hundreds and hundreds of years and is much bigger than this. So I write this book and talk about anti-fascism with a very specific point on this being one part of the story. And I talk about anti-fascists in terms of those who identify. If you identify as an anti-fascist, you're an anti-fascist. But if you don't, that's fine. There's plenty of work you can do without using that label. And in terms of who is and who is not an anti-fascist, it's not always cut and dry. I think that it's useful to think about militant anti-fascism as a specific tendency, but also to take a page out of the Italian chant, siamo tutti antifascisti, we are all anti-fascists. And when we think about pushing back against fascism, it ultimately requires resistance on a broad scale. It requires us to project a vision of a new world, to inoculate society against the appeals of fascism, to address people's problems, to organize as a whole. So in a certain sense, I think when we think of the macro injustices of society, there's a point at which anti-fascism blends into resistance more broadly, into building socialism, whatever that means to you, more broadly. And so in that sense, I think that really we can think of anti-fascism as a specific tendency, and in another sense, we're all anti-fascists. So thank you, and take some questions. Yep, in the front.
What about anti-fascism in the United States has become a huge issue with people saying they're going to call Antifa a gang and...
All right, so the question is, what about basically everything that's happening now in the US? So my apologies for not running through that. I feel like people probably are pretty up on that in this room, so that I focused on the other stuff to kind of situate the conversation, but it's totally fine to talk about what's going on today. So can you be more specific as to what aspect of what's going on that you'd like me to address?
Well, aside from the Berkeley protests and people accusing the movement of being anti-free speech, up to Steve Bannon saying that, fascists and whites and neo-Nazis are just a handful of people. Quite apart from that, are people now claiming, there's a political trend, I guess, to try to call the group a gang, and what's the story on that? Yeah.
Well,
a criminal
right,
gang,
right. So
like Rico or something.
Right, of course, right. So to catch up anyone who's not up to date, there have been reports coming out that there's discussion in the government about classifying Antifa as a specific organization, as a terrorist organization or a gang or criminal enterprise or what have you. So just at the outset, that doesn't make any sense. Antifa is not one group. It's a motive. I should have probably just taken a little care to do a little definitional work in the beginning. But in essence, it's a pan-left politics of social revolution applied to fighting the far right. Yeah, applied to fighting the far right, and is focused on direct action tactics. Doesn't turn to the state or the police to stop fascism. And that's another interesting thing, is that this is less of an issue in the United States, but in Europe, debates over anti-fascism have often fractured along the lines of, should we get the government to ban racial discrimination or fascist organizing or not? And so the militant anti-fascist tradition can perhaps most clearly be demarcated by those who, for the most part, are opposed to that strategy, opposed to it, one, for their anti-state politics in many cases, and two, for believing that that often is used against the left more than the right in practice, and there are plenty of examples of that. So when we think about the question being raised, it's important to realize that Antifa is an activity or a politics or a milieu, depending on how you think about it, and not a group that can be characterized as such. It's certainly not a quote-unquote terrorist organization. I kind of get long-winded and esoteric about the question of terrorism because I don't think it's a useful term to apply to anyone ever. So when people say, are Antifa terrorists, I say no, but I don't think that's a useful term. I think it's basically a way to excuse state violence in general, but that's another presentation. So in essence, we can see that there has been a tendency to try and classify anarchists and people that carry out direct action tactics and environmentalists and anyone who really deviates from the sort of electoral civil disobedience, quote-unquote, playbook as some sort of criminals that goes back over 100 years. I see it as essentially a variant of that. I think that certainly we need to understand it in the context of the Trump administration, where Jeff Sessions and so forth were told not to investigate the far right or white supremacists. And so clearly it's very politically motivated, but it's ridiculous and typical of how the government responds to radical politics.
How many do you think there are?
How many of?
Numbers of Antifa?
Well, I mean, in a certain sense, so the question is, how many anti-fascists are there? Everyone can raise their hand. No, I'm just kidding. No, in the U.S. Well, I mean, part of it's a question of definition, right?
Direct action, like in Berkeley.
Well, first of all, anti-fascist groups don't usually publish their membership, so I honestly, it's not possible to say. There are plenty of groups who don't even have group names. There's plenty of people who do this sometimes and other times. It's not possible to say, and yeah, so there's no membership, so I can't really answer that. All right, who else has a comment, question, concern? Hey, let's take someone in the back and come back if there's someone in the back. Yeah, in the back, or is that a scratch? Yeah, go ahead.
I mean, the conversation that I constantly, can you hear me?
Yep.
I feel like the conversation that constantly gets brought up, you know, by sort of allies who don't really get Antifa is always about how it's like ultimately, you know, bad strategically in terms of like building broader political coalitions.
Great question. Great question.
And I find that like when I get into these conversations, that I just like am constantly running into like these cul-de-sacs, you know, where fundamentally you're just saying that like how do you sort of articulate the Antifa's kind of their rules of engagement as far as violence? Because
Well,
I think that that's really important in
yeah.
terms of like engaging with people who are skeptical of it.
Well, let me first talk about the question of like strategy in coalition building and popular politics. So there's a range of perspectives, and it would be misleading to say that one or the other is the perspective, right? There are some Antifa groups who focus on stopping the organizing of the far right and have a very specific goal and aren't necessarily focused on broader politics, right? One interesting thing to think about is I spoke to a Spaniard who was part of a group, and he said, look, personally, I don't care if people hate Antifa as long as we get our job done, because when I'm not wearing my mask, I'm a trade organizer, a trade unionist, And people love me in my neighborhood, and we work, and we improve their living conditions, and we fight for a better world. When I put my mask on and I beat up Nazis, if people don't like that, as long as we're successfully beating them up, I can live with that because that's sort of like a specific container for his politics that he can always get rid of or pick up whenever he wants, and doesn't necessarily influence his sort of quote-unquote productive work. So that's one way of thinking about it that I learned from one Spaniard. Another way of looking at it is from a different Spaniard I spoke to and another French comrade, which is they have a lot of anti-fascist assemblies in Spain and France. And so, for example, in Carabanchel, which is sort of an outlying neighborhood of Madrid, I spoke to this guy who's part of a sort of militant Antifa group which keeps a low profile. But he's also part of his neighborhood's anti-fascist assembly, which is essentially the leftover of the 15M assembly that existed during the Squares movement in Spain. And so that assembly has participation from all people, not all people, but people in the neighborhood, leftists, people of different backgrounds. And then that assembly is part of what was, at least for a time, part of a Madrid para todos, a Madrid for everyone anti-fascist city assembly composed of local assemblies around the city. Now, the people that are behind a lot of this organizing are often involved in militant anti-fascist work, but people don't necessarily know it. And so the guy that I spoke to spoke of the two faces of anti-fascism. One being the kind of organizing that goes into confronting a far-right group, which doesn't necessarily overlap, but it can overlap, with kind of more popular organizing. And he says they exist parallel to each other, but don't necessarily always cross. And he says, in his opinion, that those are the two faces of anti-fascism, and we must never forget either face. That was his take, right? There's a range of perspectives. Those are just a couple, right? And I don't mean that to be inclusive. There's all sorts of takes on it, which I think are fascinating. Now, the question of violence, there is no, of course, straightforward answer, and you could speak to 100 people and get probably not 100 answers, but probably a bunch of answers, right? But what I try to focus on in explaining the perspectives that I've learned from the people I've spoken to is that it's a last resort in most cases. So the quote on the back of my book from a comrade from Baltimore, I think, I'd butcher it if I tried to remember, but you can look at the back of the book, essentially shows that, number one, most anti-fascists would rather be doing other kind of work if there weren't a fascist or white supremacist threat. They'd rather be organizing to save the environment, organizing to improve living conditions, organizing to destroy capitalism. And so in that sense, for most people that I spoke to, it's something that they'd rather not be doing. Okay, they're doing it because there's a fascist threat. Well, how do we stop the fascist threat? Well, if it could be stopped by infiltrating the group online, sowing discord among their members, having them turn on each other, and not venture out from behind their computer screens, then great. If it can be done by contacting a venue owner, organizing a boycott so that these people can't actually group themselves in public, then great. But if it comes to the point where self-defense is on the table, when it comes to the point where, as in Charlottesville, you get hundreds of armed neo-Nazis marching down the street, then the calculation changes. The earlier options aren't tenable anymore. And so ultimately, the perspective is by any means necessary, but what gets lost in that often is the necessary. If it's not necessary, it's often not necessary, right? And so in that sense, I think it generally from the people I spoke to are very thoughtful and had a very scaled understanding of how to respond to different circumstances in different places. And there's no one-size-fits-all answer with all of this. So once again, I'm not saying this based on my personal experience. I'm saying it based on people I spoke to, trying to present what they said, trying to be a messenger. Just always feel a need to say that because, people in this audience, I'm sure, have done this kind of stuff and I haven't. But, yeah. All right. Who's next? You wanted to?
Yeah, you had mentioned something a little earlier. Let me.
Do you want me to come back to you?
No, I got it right here.
Okay.
You mentioned, and my notes are just saying, popular group, people not having each other's back, and the end of the sentence might lead to genocide. Could you go back?
I was really thinking about Nazi Germany. I was thinking about the fact that the sort of Jewish elder perspective in Jewish communities in Germany was to err on the side of not alienating German society. And I'll finish and then you can, if you want to respond. That was also a debate that happened in Britain in the Jewish community about how to respond to the British Union of Fascists, and probably happened in a lot of Jewish communities and other similar communities in different times and places. So all I'm saying is if your politics is catered on predominantly trying to appeal to what mass society thinks about you, and the situation comes where mass society turns on you, then that's a problem. And that was a problem in Germany. And so that's, I think, a consideration to take into account when we talk about fighting back against the far right in the context of popular politics, that there can be certain limitations at times. Opportunities, but also limitations. Did you want to add something else?
Yeah. So would you be kind enough to put that into the context of the United States,
Sure.
which
Yes.
I think we have a very thin veil between the two-party system and this level of extremism.
Right. So I think it can be applied to that conversation, not the exact same situation, of course, but that conversation can be applied to the United States today, where the people who are saying just ignore, well, not all of them. I mean, I don't want to paint with too broad a brush, but a lot of people who are saying just ignore them can just ignore them, right? And a lot of the people who are saying that this isn't an immediate threat, that, oh, well, look, it was only a couple hundred people in Charlottesville, what's the big deal, aren't the people who they're coming for. And we can even see in Nazi Germany, there was a book that I think a historian and a sociologist published a number of years ago called What We Knew. And it was based on surveys with people who lived through Nazi Germany. And the common understanding is that in Nazi Germany, if you did anything illegal at all, no matter who you were, you would be harshly punished. But what they found is that basically, if you were a mainstream white Protestant German, you could do just about anything and the Nazis wouldn't mess with you because they weren't focused on you. And so in that way, I think what it shows is that the poem, first they came for the socialists, then they came for the Jews. That's a powerful poem, but they're not always going to come for you if you're the dominant demographic. They're just not going to come for you. So you can't simply base the politics on, well, it's in my self-interest to protect people, because in many cases, they won't come for you. So if we think about the situation today, if you are an immigrant, if you're a Muslim, if you're a queer or trans person who is experiencing this abuse on a daily basis, many of your neighbors may not care, even if they know about it. I mean, there are plenty of news articles about, it's the Southern Poverty Law Center has tallied all of the attacks, all of the terrible crap that's happened. So I want to juxtapose that with saying, of course, we should try to convince people that organizing against the far right is important. That has to be part of it, and plenty of people are doing that, right? And if you want to have a mass perspective of anti-fascism, that's certainly important. People are doing it. But to premise your organizing methods exclusively based on what the average Trump voter thinks, to me, is reversing the order of explanation. It has to work from how do we defend communities under attack, how do we protect people, how do we make sure that the advance of a fascist group from being a micro group to a medium-sized group to a large group, how do we prevent that from happening? And work in popular politics into that, work in community building into that, work in disseminating anti-racist propaganda. But that, I think the order of explanation is how I see it. And that I learned through speaking to these anti-fascists. Before that, I think I had a much more simplistic understanding of popular politics. And so that's part of what I've taken out of it. So, yeah.
I want to say thank you for a great presentation.
Thank you.
And for doing a lot of work to help bring anti-fascism into mainstream discourse. I think that there remains a really big PR problem for people today who consider themselves anti-fascists, that it's a movement that's comprised of young white men. And I appreciated a lot of what you were bringing up with the origins of anti-fascism in different parts of the world. Seems like being able to also uplift anti-fascist work with someone like Virginia Woolf, 1930s, the Three Guineas, talking about how fascism finds itself in the home, in the university, in the workplace, in the courtroom, and presenting a feminist critique of fascism. And I'll just end on one thing. I heard that in Charlottesville that people who were neo-Nazis, who were in the far right, the spectrum of hatefulness, they were referring to people who came out in Charlottesville as those Black Lives Matter protesters. And so I think if they're presupposing that potential coalition, right, that means that we need to be doing our work a lot more, right? When you have anti-fascism and Black Lives Matter and all of these other movements that are trying to do the work we're doing, not linking up and trying to have some kind of united front, solidarity front, however you want to call it, then we're missing something that is huge that I think that our opponents are actually anticipating that we could do. if that makes sense.
Yeah.
So a question
Cheers.
for you as
Yeah.
well as for everyone building coalition and trying to reframe what anti-fascism means and who's doing it.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you for all that. I want to give you a little applause for that. So, yes, entirely. And I think that part of the conversation we're having is at what point does the category of anti-fascism start to blur and maybe lose its usefulness, right? So what point are we really just talking about opposition to white supremacy, opposition to domination, opposition to transphobia, homophobia, ableism, etc.? So certainly, part of what's missed in the mainstream discussion of this whole topic is the fact that we have this broader anti-racist movement that encompasses all sorts of groups that you mentioned and more, right? And in that way, people who are actually part of self-declared Antifa groups are minuscule in all of that. And I think that we're also seeing a really exciting kind of, from all sorts of angles, direct action movement against racism as well, not just sort of against racism per se, but sort of a convergence on perspectives on not allowing them to pass, on not simply assuming that white supremacy is another opinion, right? And I think that you're right that we do need to focus on it in a broad perspective and push back against the notion that this is young white men, which is a perspective that's out there. Yes. What I also wanted to do with my book, though, and maybe I accomplished it or not, is also not try to subsume all of this into the lens of anti-fascism, which I think sometimes can be misleading. I think people should define their struggles in the way they define them, and I don't want to put that on them if they don't necessarily use it. But sometimes different groups identify in pluralistic ways. And also, I'm a European historian, so I tend to go in that direction, so you'll have to forgive me. But you're absolutely right. Yeah, thank you for that. Yes?
Is there,
You can just take the mic.
Oh, sure. Is there anything that history can teach us about preventing fascist organization in like non-physical space, like especially on like online chat rooms and stuff, or is that just kind of uncharted territory?
Yeah, so a lot of the people I spoke to talked about organizing against the alt-right, against fascists online. Of course, that's a recent development, but I spoke to one anti-fascist who described their efforts to create fake accounts, to participate in this far-right network, gain the trust of people high up in it, actually even organize staged photos of demonstrations they claim to have had in their local towns to gain trust, all towards the end of trying to sow discord, and they actually succeeded in tearing this group apart. So that happened, and that's awesome, right? Beyond that, we can see that also the lines between sort of digital organizing and in-person organizing aren't always that clear, right? So a lot of what anti-fascists do is monitoring these types of groups across multiple social media platforms. I spoke to one person who's figured out some sort of, I don't know a lot about computers, but algorithm for figuring out right-wing Facebook events, tracking who attends them, and comparing that across multiple events. So there is sort of, and then of course with an eye and keeping an eye on them in as they step out from behind the screen. Also, I think that talking about organizing in cultural spaces, and which are increasingly online, is another part of it. That wasn't a huge part of what I focus on, so I don't have much more to add than that, but I think that's super important, and I think to some extent it's something that people are kind of developing as they go. But if anyone knows more on that, please chime in. So. Yep.
So this goes back to a lot of like calling it a gang and kind of inferring that Antifa is the aggressor. And I've noticed that a lot of white nationalists or people with white pride, they see themselves as a victim and as if it's an attack against their identity. So how do you fight against that sort of rhetoric in their community if they're taking it so personally and they think that, the violence against them is an attack on their self, on their culture, on their history? How do you break through that if, it's a difference of, oh, you're attacking me versus, oh, we're attacking you?
Right. Well, I mean, the larger context, if people didn't hear the question, is far right often portrays themselves as victims and as the under attack, right? So, I mean, part of that is understanding that in history, the far right has always seen themselves as victims, no matter the context, no matter what the left does or doesn't do. Now, that, of course, doesn't necessarily help in a PR battle, because I've tried explaining that to journalists, and they don't always seem very receptive to that. But we can see that even when fascist regimes have gotten into power, they were still portraying themselves as victims in one way or another. So I think that there's limits to how much we should give a shit, maybe. There are limits. There are conversations to be had about that, and certainly, explaining the differences between being against whiteness versus being against individuals who are labeled by society and label themselves white. There are things to be done about in that way to try and explain to people that you can make a different choice in your life. You don't have to be doing this crap. You can leave being part of these groups. And I was very encouraged by the examples that I learned about in Denmark and other countries of having exit programs for white supremacists. I think there are some NGOs in the US that do that kind of work now. Can't remember the name offhand, but if someone knows the name, they can share it. And so in that way, I think we need to think through the propaganda in that way too, that sometimes trying to explain can be helpful, but there's limits to that. Related to that is also, of course, the question of aggressor and who is the aggressor. And so anti-fascist perspectives on self-defense understand self-defense in a broader way than many people do, and understand it both in an immediate sense and a preemptive sense. And I think that's historically justified. I think we can, the track record of white supremacists and fascist organizing is such that it is inherently a threat. And so I think any kind of opposition to it can legitimately be understood as self-defense. Now, there's a challenge in explaining that to people who aren't receptive, but I don't think that backing down from that perspective is useful. Not that you or anyone was suggesting that, although I'm sure some people are. I think that it's a political task. It's a task to explain what the threat of these groups are, and that, I think, is the primary focus, along with trying to address some of these questions of identity. But that's just some thoughts. It's tough, but I think in this case, going back to the early comments, my impression is that the priority should be on the task at hand. But anyway, what do I know? Yes?
Piggybacking a little bit on the perceived victimhood of the fascists, this is what I get asked about the most. The Second Amendment makes protest a little different here, and so they see themselves as victims. All of a sudden there's a militia with guns standing in front of Nazis. Now there's a new militia standing in front of the anti-fascists. What do you make of that? What do people in other countries make of guns showing up just to foster this?
Yeah. Well, the people I've spoken to in other countries I've spoken mostly to Europeans, but they're pretty freaked out by the notion of guns being involved in this. There are exceptions. In Russia, for example, there have been about a dozen anti-fascists who've been murdered over the past decade. Their firearms have appeared in the struggle in Greece and elsewhere, but it's certainly in Western Europe, it's unknown. And so I'm not trying to go too far into telling anyone what to do. I think that's generally a good way to go about it. But I don't think it's ludicrous that if white supremacists are carrying guns, that anti-fascists might want to carry guns too. I'll probably leave it at that. Yeah.
I really like what you're doing and appreciate your book and been following you on YouTube and your appearances and everything. And this last year, watching the whole rise of Trump and the whole election cycle and everything, I started thinking about, okay, what is the psychology behind these people? What is the
Which people?
Fascism,
Yeah.
the rising tide of fascism and everything. Is there some type of historical precedent? Has anyone analyzed these people? Has there been any research on psychology of it? So I came across this guy, his name was Wilhelm Reich, amazing psychoanalyst from the 1930s.
Right.
Austrian, rise of Nazism, was there analyzing everything. His perspective I find amazing. He went totally nuts later on at the end of his life. It was totally crazy. But when he was writing, I thought his writings were brilliant. When you were researching this book, when you came across him, I'm sure you must have, what were your thoughts? Should we be applying some method of analysis to how we respond for, okay, it's enough to say no, but are we building something up inside to say yes to? Does his thinking have anything to do with that?
Well, I'm familiar with him, but I haven't studied him in depth. But I think that you're right that to some extent this has to be about not only a no, but a yes. And that's the sort of the two faces of anti-fascism, as the Spaniard I spoke to put it, about how fascism is most appealing in a macro sense when you have economic depression, as you did in the Great Depression, as you did after the financial crisis of 2008, when you have feelings of alienation in society, and trying to create an alternative and to show people that, rather than becoming a crazy nationalist. You could be an awesome internationalist. That these kinds of political battles are essential. So I think it's certainly both sides of it. I'm a historian more of the left than the right per se, and this book is more about anti-fascism than fascism per se, although you can't do one without the other. But certainly, yeah, there's been a lot of studies about psychologies of fascism, about the personalities behind it, about what kinds of things they're drawn to. But that's not really my expertise, and I'm sure I wouldn't say that much that you don't already know on that. So, yeah.
So, like, I was really interested in your answer to this kind of like, as the right continues to escalate in like an American context, I mean, or not, because they've always been militarized and militant, and they always have backing of the cops. Like, it seems appropriate to respond, but also I think a lot of people are starting to worry about like if there was just like a straight up like shootout civil war, like the left probably wouldn't win. Like, so what are some of the things historically that you think that like left movements have that the right like don't, and that could like be an asset that would help in
Right. Well, I guess the first thing to say is that the anti-fascists I spoke to don't want a civil war, or at least not that civil war. And the anti-fascist goal is to stop it before it gets to that point. So that's I guess the first thing to explain. The other thing is, I mean, sort of what we're touching upon is the question of revolution and what kinds of assets revolutionary forces could count upon, could muster to confront the state, and whole nother conversation. But I think that, I guess I'll just limit my remarks to really the straightforward notion of it's great if we could stop it before it gets to that point, and there are historical precedents of it not being stopped before that point, and that's when you get really terrible things happening. I do think, though, that it's important to be at least understanding of the full range of what self-defense can look like, and not fall into the trap of being divided, the good anti-fascists, the bad anti-fascists. I actually was on a show with someone, I'm not going to say who they are because whatever, but he disagrees with me about stuff, and he was saying, oh, well, you're a good anti-fascist. I was like, so I'll leave it at that. Yeah?
So you mentioned a couple of tactics, but I'd love to hear some more.
Yeah, sure. So I have a section in my book on sort of creative alternative tactics. One of my favorite stories was in Denmark in the 90s. There was a fascist house, or really an explicitly Nazi house, created. And one of the main tactics used to respond to them was to have nightly singing vigils outside their window that drove them crazy. Ultimately, though, the house was actually uprooted because a woman from Butte, Montana, who was related to the original owner of the house, pursued a legal case to show that actually she was the rightful owner of the house and had them evicted. So that's kind of an interesting story. I learned about a puppet protest in Texas where there was a Klan rally on the steps of a courthouse or something, and they had this huge puppet show actually involving what was it, like gallows for Klansmen or something. It was a dark spectacle, but certainly an alternative way of going about it. Another was one that happened in the Netherlands, where local anti-fascists who essentially, as it was explained to me, the anti-fascist movement was at a lull. They couldn't mobilize a lot of people. So rather than taking all the leftists from the major cities to go out to the smaller areas to protest, they essentially, a handful of anti-fascists went out to the town where the far-right demonstration was going to be in advance, and tried to organize locally, and essentially found relatively good success getting locals who actually were much more militant and confrontational than the leftists when push came to shove, and in that way sort of thinking about who the anti-fascists are, who's the demographic, who can do what. I thought that was an interesting story. The notion of kind of creating another one is in Denmark, at least in the 90s, they would often call the parents of neo-Nazi skinheads. And that worked like better than any other tactic. Now, of course, that relies on the fact that you have to have parents who are opposed to that, right? But in their case, they did. So those are a few things that come to mind, but I have other ones in the book. How Bluestocking organizers? How long do we want to go? I just I don't have a sense of time. We're good? All right. Well, you let me know. All right. Who else? Let's take people who haven't asked a question. Yes.
So you're going to talk about the relationship of Antifa to free speech.
Okay, free speech. So I asked everyone I interviewed what their thoughts were on anti-fascism and free speech, and I think that the answers that I got can be divided into two main perspectives. The first perspective is that Anti-fascism is not against free speech because when we talk about the First Amendment, that's a governmental protection against speech. Anti-fascists are not the government. Anti-fascists are not calling on the government to censor anyone. They're mobilizing against fascist organizing, not speech per se. If a random individual says some crazy stuff, that's not necessarily the focus of what they're doing. It's against organizing. That's sort of one perspective that I heard articulated frequently. Another perspective was no free speech for fascists, end stop. So those are the two different perspectives, but they're sort of united in the rejection of the liberal framing of the question, which to me is the main takeaway, which is that if we see the struggle against fascism as a political struggle, and we do not concede to fascism or white supremacy the status of being a respectable opinion, and we don't see the struggle as sort of creating a regime of rights where neo-Nazis and their victims coexist and have a reasonable dialogue, if we see the goal as eradicating these politics, then that, in my mind and the mind of the anti-fascists I spoke to, changes the equation and means that the goal is not to sort of think about what these kinds of rights should be, but rather how do we eradicate these politics. So that's sort of, I mean, in some countries it's more important than others. So I have a chapter about the free speech question. And I gave the book to a reader from Austria, and he's like, why do you have a whole chapter about free speech? This is not really the point. And I said, I understand that, but this is a book for Americans. But I've spoken to people in the Netherlands who say that actually, maybe in the 90s it wasn't such a big deal, but starting in the 2000s, for reasons that are too long to explain, it started to be a big deal. So it changes. The Greeks I spoke to were absolutely incredulous that that's even a consideration. So, you know, it depends. A few things, though, that I think are worth adding is that there's an assumption that we have, quote unquote, full free speech right now. But there are all sorts of restrictions on speech, whether it be libel or obscenity or copyright infringement or corporate license and so forth, all sorts of restrictions. And so the notion that we have this absolutist free speech that's being infringed upon, of course, is not actually true. And in a capitalist society, when we think about stratification of speech, the notion that speech is completely free is ludicrous. There's all sorts of layers I get into. Ultimately, those are the two perspectives, but I think they're united by a rejection of the liberal framing of the question and by seeing it as a political struggle rather than sort of a management of rights. Yeah. So, who else? Let's see if anyone hasn't asked a question wants to. If not, we'll come over here. Yes. Yes.
I guess I've been noticing, like, recently an increase of people who have just gotten into politics, see what's happened in Charlottesville, and I came in late, so this might have already been asked.
It's fine, go ahead.
But seeing what's happened in Charlottesville, and like, yeah, punch Nazis, let's like also fight for legislation, you know, to censor people, which I consider like a risky move because our government sympathizes with fascists and that can be easily used against people pursuing social justice. Yeah. Have you seen an increase in that at all?
Well, I think a lot of people are trying to figure out what to do. And the sort of traditional political divisions along these lines are not self-evident to most people. So, you know, in Europe, which I keep coming back to as an example because I'm a European historian, I wrote about that case, traditionally most socialist and communist parties have been in favor of a legislative solution to the problem and have often, though not always, been opposed to direct action tactics. And so part of the reason why militant anti-fascism developed in a lot of these countries is to take the other angle. And so the lines between these are very clear. And then you also have the division between the anti-fascist movement and the anti-racist movement, which you can see in groups like SOS Racisme in France and a more kind of legislative, electoral, NGO kind of model. So those divisions exist. I'm sympathetic to the militant anti-fascist argument that if you look at the track record of this legislation, it's often used against the left as well as the right, sometimes more so. And so I wouldn't be subscribing to that perspective myself. But you know, these are all political options and perspectives that just have to be hashed out through developing a movement. And that's the thing that, you know, everyone should get involved in doing. But I think that even so, even if some people do think that legislation is the way to go, we can still get on the same page about direct actions and don't have to bifurcate. Yes?
So after Charlottesville, there was a piece that I think went around on Slate that quoted a bunch of nonviolent interfaith clergy who had organized, and they credited with anti-fascists for saving their life. And I was wondering if historically you
Gotcha. So, referencing the case in Charlottesville when Cornel West and other clergy credited anti-fascists for saving their lives when they showed up to participate in civil disobedience actions and found that there were no police there to arrest them and that they were vulnerable. So yeah, there's a lot of examples in a lot of places around the world where anti-fascism is a necessary component of social movement politics, because if there aren't people to stop the right, they're going to get overrun. So, you know, one of the more kind of notable recent examples came in Sweden several years ago when there was an immigrant rights demonstration and fascists showed up with knives, and an anti-fascist defended the crowd with a knife, ended up stabbing someone, and he's in prison at the moment. Joel, his name is. I talk about him in the book. There's other examples. I spoke to a French anti-fascist who was part of a group that protected some trade unionists against a fascist attack. And he said afterwards, the solidarity between the anti-fascist and unionists was like really strong, right? So a lot of politics in general is developing these actual lived relationships. And so if the media says one thing about a group, people can base their own experiences to assess it and say, no, I know these people, they protected the group I did. So much of what fascists do is targeting left organizing. We've even seen over the last 6 months or so several instances of like Identity Europa and other groups coming into anti-racist trainings and disrupting them. So that is a real consideration that's increasingly on the map, unfortunately. And so in some cases, you're right that it's a kind of necessary component that people don't get a choice whether to do or not if they don't want to be mauled. And so we'd like that not to have to be a consideration, but it can be, and that's part of it. Yeah?
Kind of related to this question, do you know if there's group tactics in terms of protecting people who are undocumented or people who aren't able-bodied? Like, so if they are participating in a street confrontation, there's, kind of a playbook for that.
Well, I mean, I think here we're meeting the limits of my knowledge. So, because I didn't write the book as a way of stepping back. It's called the Anti-Fascist Handbook because I wanted the book to be explicitly partisan and I wanted it to be useful. So there's a section, for example, on advice from anti-fascists of the present and the past to those of the future. 50% of the author's proceeds are going to an anti-fascist international defense fund. I tried to write the history as a way to be useful, but I didn't get into the really nitty nuts and bolts with my the organizers I spoke to. I don't have the experience myself, so I think at this point is where I probably will say you should talk to someone else as far as the actual nitty gritty of standing in the way. You want to? Huh?
I mean, there's so much more than confrontation in anti-fascist action, right? No, you've done this.
Go on.
Sorry, I'm a partner.
Go on.
No.
Okay. Yes. Well, so as my partner intelligently pointed out, there is much more to it than confrontation. But in terms of the specific confrontational attacks, I'm just trying to make it clear that there's only so much that I can share. But certainly, as far as coalition building, as far as working with different groups to make it so that there aren't professionals doing this all the time. Because another thing that I came across in some scenes is sometimes certain milieu are less likely to take up the struggle against fascism if they feel like there's quote unquote professionals who are doing it for them. And so sometimes bridging that divide can be important. And so the example of going into communities in the Netherlands and empowering people to do the work themselves is inspiring. So there is more to it than that. But as far as really nitty-gritty stuff, probably people who've done it would be better because I don't have a whole lot on that. Sorry. Anyone who hasn't asked a question? Yeah.
I guess one of the things I'm thinking about, and I'm not really sure if this is a proper question, but you're talking a lot about the street skirmishes and how people are self-organizing here in Europe and so on. But part of the purpose of the street skirmish is state power. And a lot of what we're seeing here, at least in the States, is this kind of teetering balancing act where anti-fascists have to deal with heavily militarized police who are often stepping back to see who gets killed first, and then sometimes they go into mop up the mess. But and this is where I'm getting fuzzy about what I want to ask, where in your book do you deal with this sort of precipice of smaller street skirmishes like, let's say, the Battle of Cable Street, and the police force that that community had to deal with, and the police force our community has to deal with.
Right. So you can't really have the conversation without talking about the state and the police, right? And there's several angles to address with that. One is the question of overt sympathy, the oft-repeated slogan, cops and Klan go hand in hand. Related to that, of course, also is the notion of even if they don't go hand in hand, they're still cops. And the question of how to deal with the fact that often police are going to be more hostile to anti-fascists than fascists, et cetera, et cetera. So here's where I think the politics come into it, because militant anti-fascism, not exclusively but generally over the past decades, has been a revolutionary socialist position that has a critique of the state in many cases, or at least the capitalist state. And so in that sense, if you look at the Battle of Cable Street, if you look at the Battle of Lewisham and other examples, you're going to have a situation where the police are trying to stop this work from going on. And so it seems that part of the anti-fascist messaging should also talk about the police, how it is, as many have phrased it, a three-way fight, and how simply because the police may not openly identify as fascist doesn't mean that they're not part of a larger system that allows these groups to grow and that in some cases provides a red carpet for them to advance. That's a really important point. I don't have much more to say, but yeah, it has to be part of the conversation. Yeah. Yeah. Do you want to add anything else, or you?
No, I just...
Yeah. Thank you for adding that.
Yeah.
Someone else who hasn't? Yep.
Piggybacking off that
Yeah.
question, and I'm not sure whether you stipulate against talking about this.
Go ahead.
But do you know what's being done to support the J20 defendants?
Okay, so do you want to explain to everyone what that is? Because most people probably know, but maybe not everyone.
I think
Oh, yeah, okay, so right, on Inauguration Day in Washington, D.C., there was an anti-fascist demonstration against Donald Trump. A lot of people were arrested and charged with ludicrous charges, as much as 75 or 80 years, based on the claim that they were inciting a riot, even though they're not even being charged with breaking anything or anything like that. So there is a campaign in support. I encourage people to look up the Defend J20. That is part of the anti-fascist struggle. And I think it's incumbent upon all of us to support these defendants, whether or not that march was what we would necessarily participate in, because anti-fascism is about solidarity, is about standing up for each other across different political lines. There have been benefit events. There have been, does anyone here want to add to that or give a plug to anything going on with that? Yeah, I mean, it's certainly part of the conversation. Do you want to? Yeah, please do. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Ella, I'm a J20 defendant. And so, yeah, 200 people were mass arrested, protesting against Trump and everything he stands for during the inauguration. So everyone just kind of kettled on a street corner and charged with one blanket felony charge for rioting. And then they returned to superseding indictment, so now everyone's facing 8 blanket felony charges, which amounts up to 8 years in prison. So we're all still facing that, and the first trial's in November. So in New York, if you want to plug in, you can check out the 5-Borough Anti-Repression Committee. We have a Facebook page, that's about it right now. We do have a listserv, so we'll keep people up to date with events and everything. We could definitely use more support and awareness, because we've been tabling every Sunday and a lot of people still aren't aware of the case. So if you could spread the word as much as possible, we'd definitely appreciate it.
Can you let people know that if they want to sign up for this, they can do so at the counter later at the event?
So if you're interested in joining the 5-Borough Anti-Repression Committee, you have a sign-up sheet over there with Corey. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Yep. Go ahead.
Excuse me. So, I'm going to try not to be long-winded. I also hear Senya already laughing. A lot of times in the common narrative that exists in the media, in the American context, when someone is no longer identifying as a fascist, they get, they do 40 million interviews, and they're like, yes, I used to be a Nazi, and now I'm like a cool punk guy with tattoos, and and I'm not a part of that anymore, or whatever, right? And it's always like this kind of rare novelty in America, but it's like an overrepresented novelty, right? Nearly like a kind of mass appeal, like people hoping for this. If we spread the word of this guy enough, people, the little kid in the Klan costume will want to grow up and be this guy or something.
Yeah.
I don't know what the thing is, but in the European context that you were studying, where there were these fascist movements and that became large, I know there's a lot of confusion about just in the general historical understanding about the class makeup of these groups, of some of the motivations individually, initially, and then the kind of mission creep that occurs with the ideology. Are there, outside of the instances of the countries in which there was like literally mass killings in the course of World War II, are there examples in Europe in which fascist organizations or withered and not so much in that these people withered away from public life and existed in this kind of shame hole somewhere, but that they arrived at different political conclusions and as individuals or as groups, and then wound up going on to be part of a more progressive or at least at middle like liberal vision?
No. Well, what I will say is that what it makes me think of, which I can use your comment to talk about, is to some extent you can see like with some of the more quote-unquote respectable mainstream parties like the Front National and so forth, that there are instances, right, where more explicitly neo-Nazi groups back in the day, like in the 1970s in the Front National's case, wanted to create a more respectable-looking political front, and to some extent those parties have at times distanced themselves from the more explicit kind of Nazi origins of the parties. But still, that's not a long walk that they've gone. You know, as far as going from being like outright fascist to being radically different politically, I don't know of any significant examples of any groups at all. If someone else does, I'd love to hear about it, but I don't know any examples anywhere. But certainly in terms of the question of individuals, right, there is this notion that the way that you can combat quote-unquote hate is by changing hearts and minds. And so that gets overrepresented. There are examples of that happening, and that's great when it happens, but it becomes an individualistic moral tale that reflects the degree to which, to a large extent, the Western understanding of fascism and Nazism has been very personal and moral and ethical, and based on seeing Nazism, for example, as an evil, and anyone could potentially be subject to it in a sense of like, you know, you can even see like with the suit Nazi or a grammar Nazi that like basically it gets reduced to your being a real jerk. And so in that individualistic way, right, the solution to it is let's change these people's minds to not be such Nazis anymore. And that's partly why we get this false moral equivalency of anyone who is engaging in illiberal politics is therefore all the same and therefore all Nazis. So obviously we need to talk about it in a structural way, in a political way, as a struggle. But specifically, I don't know any examples of those things. Yeah.
So, I guess I was thinking more along the lines of, in a modern context, something like not that an organization would change its ideological basis. I mean, that's pretty difficult, but I guess, and maybe there just isn't the information offhand, but if there'd been like studies on, let's say, a group like EDL in England, if there'd been some kind of ability to study their makeup, because these groups do rise and fall, right, in terms of like their size, and then it would be interesting
in terms of the individuals and who they are and what.
It just studies that show like, okay, this group at this point peaked in size, withered, or like Golden Dawn, right, like large numbers, then small numbers, then large numbers, and it'd be interesting to know just not just the motivating social and larger political forces, but also what are the outcomes socially and politically for some of the individuals, or if we think of them as a group.
Okay. Yeah, well, there's been a lot of studies on the class background, the professional occupations, by looking at membership rosters of different parties in different times and places. I'm not sure what to say more than that, but there have been studies like that. I don't have anything specific to add to that, but that's a good question. Yeah. Let's maybe take one more, because I'm sure people want to just kind of not do this anymore. So maybe one more. I just lose track of time. So yes, right here.
Okay, I'm in Germany, and are there engaged in anti-fascist struggles for several years.
Great.
And lots of the topics raised here, we are dealing with basically the same kind, like question of free speech and transforming from hardcore racist Hitler fans to some new right, which is comparable to alternative right in the US. But I'm wondering where the popularity of the term anti-fascist comes from in the US. And I guess it's much more or less the motivation for you to write this book.
Yeah.
And in Germany, anti-fascism was the political issue for younger people to start engage into radical politics, because to be against Nazis, these hardcore Nazis, is quite constant. Sometimes it's all society. But once you got into this movement, you got in touch with like radical feminism and anti-capitalism and all these issues, and this made the popularity of the movement. And it was like this from early 90s until early 2000s or something. But now we are facing this transformation of the fascist threat, which is no more these few militant Hitler fan people, but more it's a real political movement with like the identitarian you mentioned and the so-called alternative for Germany, which is probably entering the parliament in 2 weeks with roughly 10% or something. And when it comes to this, you cannot go onto the street and punch these people away. So you have to deal with terms of, I don't know, struggles for hegemonic projects.
Right. Yeah. Do you want to add anything else? Or? Yeah, that's a great question. In chapter 3 of the book, essentially the main focus of the chapter is how to deal with popular right-wing formations that have these kinds of fascist and Nazi origins, but present themselves as being more respectable, like Pegida, like the Front National, Alternative for Germany. There's all sorts of examples. And to some extent, the anti-fascists I interviewed were struggling to come up with a way to deal with that, the ones I spoke with at least. There was a little bit of an indeterminacy about how to do it, because certainly the militant anti-fascist repertoire was not designed primarily for dealing with parties with mass followings that are in parliament and have respectable appearances. I don't have a solution for that either, but I do like what I heard from someone who went by the name of Jim, who said, at a certain point, we need to do our politics better than they do theirs. And so I don't have an answer for that, and it's certainly a struggle, but it seems like part of it also has to be that organizing in other ways has to feed into the anti-fascist struggle as well. But that is certainly a problem. The folks I spoke to didn't really have a great answer for it. I'd love if you have thoughts on it to share, but that has to be part of the consideration, and I guess it shows that, at least in my opinion and in the opinion of many of the people I spoke with, anti-fascism has to be part of a politics, but not the entirety of a politics. And I discussed that issue with people in France, the Netherlands, Germany, and elsewhere in chapter 3 of the book. You can check it out. So I think we're going to stop here. I'm getting hot. Thank you all very much.